we try.
Greetings from Cambridge Cable TV on May 17th, 2015. This is Be Live, produced by Terrence Rothman. I'm Pam Greenberg.
And I'm Alice LoCicero.
And tonight we're going to be talking about the aftermath of the marathon bombing and how it affected those of us in Cambridge. It was only a couple of years ago that we learned that the bombs set off at the Boston Marathon were set off by a resident of Cambridge, and we'll be talking about how it affected those of us in the Cambridge community and about what we can do as a community to heal. And so I'm wondering if we can maybe begin by talking a little bit about how you got involved in this issue, how you came to be.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking, Pam. I live in Cambridge, as you know, and at the time that we learned that the people who did the marathon bombing were two young men from Cambridge who'd gone to schools in Cambridge and lived in Cambridge and so on, I think a lot of people in Cambridge, I know a lot of people in Cambridge, were just distraught and puzzled and confused. I'm a researcher. I've been working on how kids get immersed in violence for a long time, and I knew that I had something to offer here, so that I then decided that I should write something that maybe would help answer some of the questions that people in Cambridge had. You know, because you assisted me in that. I appreciated your help. And I hope that I could help Cambridge to understand better. There was just so much distress, understandably, because of learning that these two young men had been here, and how did this possibly happen? So many questions unanswered.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are sitting with questions, and some of us are sitting with them alone. I think, which is a problem. I was struck when thinking about today, I was struck that, in Boston, the response that you saw most often was the sort of the Boston Strong, the Boston
Right.
Strong t-shirts. And in Watertown, where I've been working, there's the Watertown Strong now t-shirts.
Uh-huh.
And we couldn't really say that in Cambridge because the bombers were from Cambridge, and to say Cambridge Strong somehow was like the wrong response. But it seems that in many ways we haven't really had a response. So, a communal response to what happened. And I'm wondering if you want to talk about that and some of your thoughts.
Yeah, I think a lot of the responses have been very individual. People had different relationships with these young men and with their family. But I also think that if we could think of a general response in Cambridge, I think the most common responses have been puzzlement, disbelief, and also shame. Some sense that, how could this have happened in our city, which was, did we do something wrong? Did Cambridge make some mistakes? Was there some way, and I think many individuals feel this as well as the community at large, was there something that could have been done differently that would have prevented this happening?
Yeah, I think a lot of people I've talked to have that response, and I think it's probably even more so a response of the people who are closest to those brothers, people in the school system, people, if we think about the different communities within Cambridge and how they were affected, maybe we can talk a little bit about that. Like, who are the different communities in Cambridge? How do we, experience grief, pain? We have this sort of communal pain, but we also have like particular kinds of.
Right. For example, a small example might be the teachers who had taught these young men, wondering could they have picked up on something early on. The peers that they hung out with, I think, are just terribly chagrined and in grief, because they lost the young men that they knew, who they knew as good kids. I think in addition, the peers have had other things to cope with, probably the teachers as well, in the sense of being questioned quite a lot by authorities. Understandably, the authorities needed to know as much as they could know to be sure there weren't other collaborators and so on. But I think that's hard on kids. These are young adults. They were in college by now, and I think they had a really hard time. I think just a lot of people had a hard time. Parents of the friends of the bombers and so on. And I encountered a lot of that when I was speaking in different venues in Cambridge. As you know, this is the book that I wrote because I wrote it because I knew a lot about this, and certainly the Chernayev brothers are not the only good kids who then were recruited into militia as either child soldiers or as soldiers or as people who would be involved in terrorist activities. And I spoke in a number of venues in Cambridge, and so in those venues there were always a question, and in and around Cambridge there were always question and answers, and I learned from that a lot of people had a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of chagrin. And I had actually hoped that by writing the book and helping people to understand better, that would help begin the healing process. Maybe I should have known better, but I think there's a lot more emotional healing that still needs to be done.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of questions people were asking you?
Yeah, of course, there's the question that keeps coming up in the media and on individuals and so on, which is, why? How could this have possibly happened? There is this incredible disbelief because they were really known as good kids. And in particular, I'll mention more about Johar because I was able to learn more about him. As you know, the older brother was killed in the police action. But Johar, we know quite a bit about him. He was very well integrated into the community of peers, and he was very well liked. He was seen as a really good kid by his teachers, by his peers, and people are just, how could this happen? I also found that a number of parents became concerned, could this happen to my kid? As well as this. There were also some very unexpected and really interesting questions, such as, is he redeemable? Should we forgive him? Could he help us if he's lived to be able to understand these processes better? Questions that I frankly had not anticipated. But these are questions that are nagging and on the minds of a lot of people in Cambridge.
Yeah.
As well as, of course, these questions, did we do something right? Did we miss something? Could we have done something different?
Right, so there are those questions, I think, like how could we have prevented it? How could this have happened? And then there's the question of how we deal with it, the aftermath of the event, and how we come together and create something like healing. And when I was thinking about today, I was thinking about the word that gets thrown around so much in the media is like the word closure, this idea that we could ever come to something like closure for some, for an event like this, for something that really shook our community and our sense of ourselves so deeply. And so, yeah,
I mean, closure's not really, it's kind of an overrated concept. I think the more we use that term, the more we realize that closure isn't very likely in any of these tragic circumstances, especially a community tragedy. I think that some people, I'm going to show a headline from the New York Times, some people thought that after the trial was over there'd be closure. But in fact, as you can see from today's headline from the New York Times, and I totally agree with this, that the sentencing and the trial left people very unsettled. It wasn't the kind of thing that led to closure. I think there's processes that lead people forward. I think closure probably is something we aren't going to find, probably not even in this generation, but we will be able to move on. That's the goal, I think.
Yeah, I think in some ways maybe a better word might even be opening. You know what I mean? That there's a kind of, that we talk about, like we have to put a boundary around it and close it off from ourselves. But in a way, maybe what is needed is a kind of opening to what did this mean? How can we learn from it? What can we...
I mean, you and I have talked about this, Pam. I've talked about this before. There has been a kind of quietness, a kind of people in Cambridge, the city of Cambridge, the community of people not really talking much about this. And that maybe, so we're going maybe from what's already a kind of closure in the sense of closing off to an opening of some kind. That's what we would hope for. That's what I'm hoping for, and that's what this series of programs will hopefully lead us to.
Yeah. So, so you've talked a little bit already about like some of the communities, you know, of people who are affected after the bombing. You know, the people who are close to the brothers, the people who are the neighbors who maybe saw these brothers in passing, you know, but didn't really talk to them. Maybe now thinking they should have talked to them. I'm thinking too, now as a parent in the schools of, you know, people who have kids who are going into kindergarten or younger kids who are not necessarily peers of those brothers, but think like, well, what, you know, what does this say about our community? I think also of the pain of people in the Muslim community who think like, maybe, you know, this reaction, like, why did it have to be a Muslim? You know, why, you know, because...
You know, we know that in the U.S. there's a great deal of Islamophobia. I mean, that's a real thing. It actually exists. And there's hate crimes. There are just the less severe kind of distrust and worry and negative feelings. There's profiling. Members of the Muslim community go through a lot, and this is just adding fuel to that. And I think there's even some sometimes quiet, sometimes overt distrust about the mosque where these young men worshipped. And I'm sure that the people in that mosque have their own burdens of concern as a result. So yeah, there's just many different constituencies. When you talk about the parents, though, and we've talked about this as well, I've often wondered, and some of the people that I speak to have also talked about wondering, many people will say, and certainly there's plenty of evidence about this, that the Chernayev brothers were very, very well supported in Cambridge. The teachers loved them, their peers liked them and loved them, and they had a lot of support and a lot of help and a lot of opportunity. And in particular, again, I'll focus on Johar. I think many people have asked this question, including myself. I've pondered it a great deal. If the invitation to Johar to participate in this hideous bombing activity, if that had come through to him while he was in Cambridge, while he had the mentoring of teachers, while he had his coaches, while he had this very supportive peer group, might the outcome have been different? And I think I myself and a lot of people think there's a pretty good chance that the outcome would have been different. I don't find much fault with the kind of support that Johar had in Cambridge. Sure, there are things that might have been done a little better. It would have been extremely extraordinary for Cambridge to have been more attuned to some of the past trauma, for example, that the brothers had, which I think we can understand going forward might be useful. But in general, I think they had a great deal of support here, and I really do wonder what the impact of being out of Cambridge with less support in a different community and so on has had on Johar, and he had fewer people he knew for a long time to talk to on a regular basis. So we'll never know, of course. That'll be one of those unanswered questions for which we'll never have closure. But I think Cambridge actually can be generally pretty happy with what was provided. Again, I have in my book, and I speak about this, there are some things that I think we can do better going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just struck by, Cambridge really prides itself on being a diverse, inclusive community, and also a community that, despite diversity, comes together. And the schools, are very diverse. There's a lot of, there's a big immigrant population, and so I'm just struck that everybody is sort of responding to this differently. We have a communal response as all residents of the city of Cambridge, and then we all have our unique response to this event, maybe also based on whether or not we've suffered trauma in our own lives. You know, I mean, like that's another factor that kind of helps to, you know.
I want to stress the word that you used, inclusive, because, you know, some people talk about tolerance. I think Cambridge has been way more proactive than tolerance. I think there's an active effort to include all kids in the activities and in the support that the school offers. I also think, although no government and no police are perfect, none of us is perfect, but I think the government, I think the authorities, the security, the police, I think have done a pretty darn good job in Cambridge. And so there's a lot to be proud of in terms of our inclusiveness. But again, I agree with you, we still have these divisions, and we have our own personal grieving and our own personal traumas to deal with. But what we're talking about in this series of programs, which I think is really most important, is how the community comes together to heal. And I am aware that not everybody really is knowledgeable about community healing. And people think of, well, if you've got trauma, you go to your therapist, or you go to your spiritual advisor, you go to your family and your group, and you somehow work it through, and then you feel better, or it's hard to work through, and you do your best. But what about communal trauma, whatever that is? I mean, we have to think about that as well.
Right.
And I think the city, the community has divisions. Just as, you know, one of the ways that people have begun to think about trauma recently, individual trauma, is that it signals kind of a disconnect. And that's a biological process, a disconnect between emotions and thoughts, between the body and the mind and heart. So those disconnections have to be integrated together and healed for personal trauma. But we also have to think about a community trauma as being disconnections among individuals and groups of people. And the healing for the community really is the healing of groups coming together. Now, what does that mean? Because we could think about, well, people have to heal by talking it all out. And actually, I think what we've learned, both in individual work and also in community work, is that that's probably not the best approach. People can talk for a long time and maintain their positions. They come from places of hurt and pain and from trauma and sometimes even defensiveness and anger. And that's not going to be easily solved, and certainly not easily solved with words. Now, we can have dialogue processes, and they will help, but I think there are other approaches that are probably more fit for the kind of situation that Cambridge faces now.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were left, I mean, feeling that there really weren't words, you know what I mean? That there weren't words for what happened. They didn't know. Yeah. And also, I think a lot of us felt so much conflict within ourselves over our own responses. Like, you know, we didn't have one unified response even within each of us individually.
Yeah, Pam, you are so right. You know, we know in groups, like such as in group therapy or other kinds of groups, everyone in the group has a mixture of emotions and a mixture of perceptions and feelings. Nobody's like so focused and single-minded. It's very, very rare, if it even occurs at all. And in a group, usually each person may take one position, but that's only the position they take. That doesn't mean that's entirely how they feel. All the people probably have all the feelings and all the positions within them. Mm-hmm. And I would say the same is probably true for the groups and sub-communities and so on in Cambridge, that while some group may take a particular stance, they probably also have some other feelings within. They can see, you know, they can imagine and feel some conflict, some conflicting feelings. And so I think what we have is people take stances, groups take stances, but in fact, everyone's feelings are very complex and sometimes contradictory.
And sometimes maybe even change over time.
Oh, you know,
because I was remembering myself. I mean, I think we all have memories of where we were on that day, what happened. I remember I was with my son, actually. We didn't go to see the marathon, but we were in downtown Boston, and we couldn't get a train home. And I was seeing on the TV a little bit about what was going on, but my son, who was like 5 at the time, I didn't really want to tell him what was going on. And we're looking for a way to get home, and I don't know. So at that moment, you're just, you have one response, and then you're in lockdown in Cambridge, and you have another emotional response, I mean, because those of us, in Cambridge, we're in that kind of lockdown mode, and
Stay
the fear,
indoors,
and there was, and then as time goes on and we learn more about the actual people, and I think for many of us there's a sense of tragedy,
Right.
So what went wrong. So
Tragedy is a great word for it.
yeah. So so I'm wondering a bit, we've talked a little bit about this, but maybe you can talk a little more about trauma, about communal trauma. How do we heal from it? And what does it even mean to heal from trauma?
Good question. So I searched, when I realized that my academic cognitive approach wasn't going to be sufficient, I searched my own memory, my own experiences. I talked to many, many people and tried to think about how do communities come together, and what does it even mean to come together? And one of the things that I remembered was a recent event that I was an observer for, which was a group of people coming together who had had some exposure to other people's trauma over time. And a program was set up for them in which they did artwork together and created many different projects, which they then integrated together into one major project, which the group really loved and was incredibly proud of. And we took some photos of it and so on, as you can see here. And that project was sponsored by an expressive therapist from the Lesley University Expressive Therapies program. Then I remembered that I had taken part in a program 1 year after the bombings, sponsored also by the Institute for Arts and Health at Lesley University. And that program, called Under Pressure, talked about unanswered questions, which of course there still are many unanswered questions. But I noticed how sharing in an art situation, was a performance, there was drama, there was music and so on. And that was a healing experience for people. This is the website of the Institute for the Arts and Health. And I, knowing about this institute and knowing that they had some approaches that I think were healing, I reached out, and luckily for us, people from that institute were very willing to help. And this is a bit first in a series of programs that will be educational in nature, leading to hopefully some participatory programs in the future. But first we need to have people learn about what it means to use expressive therapies, arts, in order to heal a community. This is a photo of Vivian Marco Spicer, who's the director of this institute, and who was just so incredibly helpful. I have a couple of quotes from her, which may help. I mean, I can give you my idea of how arts helps, but I want to use her words and make sure we get through these. All of these forms, including the arts and including the public events, are ritual ways a society moves through and enacts and comes to terms with changes and loss. And what can't be said in words can be said in paint and performance. And because people express and understand expression in different ways, we need different kinds of forms so people can get it in their own way. She shared with us also some photos from a recent conference at the Institute. And you'll be able to see there's some work being done here. And this is one of my favorite photos that shows this way that people are coming together. And here's more I also want to talk about another person who's going to host some of these programs, Mitchell Kosak, who's a division director at Lesley in their expressive therapies program. He also was involved in a healing program shortly after the bombings, and here's some quotes from him about expressive therapies, a field pioneered at Lesley. He says, they provide a vehicle for people to tell their stories, be heard, and receive empathy. People who have been through trauma like the marathon bombings, even those who weren't at the finish line, when you get them in a room with a trained arts therapist doing activities such as singing songs, writing poetry, and making music, it helps relieve their stress and gives them hope. Here are some photos from a program that he did at the Emmanuel Church. Yeah, I know we're getting close to the end of our program here. I think what happens in expressive therapies is that people don't necessarily resolve their differences, but what they do is they understand how they share pain, how they share the need to move ahead. And the identity as members of a community becomes very, very salient, more salient than their divisions. And again, I'll let them show us and tell us in the succeeding programs how this happens because they are the experts. But I've been so impressed by the work that they do. And I think that's really what Cambridge needs to do. Come together in this overarching identity. And also, Mitchell talks about the concept of attunement. When you're doing art with other people, you're attuned. It's a biological process as well as a psychological process. You're in it together. And that's what he talks about. And I look forward to successive programs in this series where he can make that even more clear. And the next program